Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 13, Part 1. This is about quasi-experiments. Quasi means quasi or quasi, depending how you say it. Quasi means kind of, right? Not exactly. Approaching. Quasi, all right? So these are not exactly experiments, but they're like experiments. That's why they're called quasi-experiments. So, when we talk about these, a quasi-experiment really is just, um, it looks like an experiment except you don't actually assign participants to levels of the independent variable. You don't do a true manipulation, is what we're saying. That is, that the manipulation is not assigned by the researchers in a way that controls for the other variables. So a quasi-experiment is one where you want to do a basic experiment, but let's say you can't actually assign people to different levels of that independent variable. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between a quasi-experiment and a correlational study? In a quasi-experiment, normally you're trying to control for other things so that it's not just measuring something. So, for example, let's say that we wanted to know what things affect your grades, and we think that maybe women have better grades than men. Well, in that case, we would just kind of measure, are you a man or a woman, and then measure what your grades are. That would be a correlational design because we're just kind of measuring one thing and measuring another. In a quasi-experiment, you try to control for these things. There's stuff that you can't totally independently manipulate, but you try and do it. So, for example, um, you could do whether or not whether or not access to sunlight um, causes people um, to have better grades. Well, in this case, what you would do is you would look at people in a dorm building, for example, the ones who who are on the south side compared to the ones who are on the north side. Now, you didn't put them in those different groups, but they should be pretty similar because the reason why they're in one room or another is relatively random. It's not completely random, but whether somebody's on the north side or the south side might they should be pretty equivalent, right? Those groups would be pretty equivalent to each other. So we're trying to control for other things like where they're from and all that stuff because that should be relatively equal between those two groups. Just happens to be that one's on the south side, so they get more sun, and one's on the north side, so they get less sun. So, in reality, it's very similar. And then you can also mix this up. So you could have a factorial design where one independent variable is truly manipulated and the other one is it's really just measured. When we do the quasi experiments, we got to consider what kind of design we're looking at, whether it's independent groups or within groups. So when we do an independent groups design, it's a quasi experiment. What we are doing is actually a non-equivalent control group design. So what you just heard, heard from me about the sunlight, whether it's on the north side or south side, that would be a non-equivalent control groups design, right? We didn't actually assign people to be one or the other. It just happened that way. So another one would be, let's say that there was a power outage and only one side of the street got their power out and the other side of the street had power. And we wanted to see whether or not power outages affect birth rates 9 months later on. Well, in this particular case, they're non-equivalent control groups because we did not assign you to either get your power out or keep your power on. But they're roughly the same, And so what we would do is we'd look at the group that had their power out on one side of the street compared to the other side of the street and then see 9 months later if there's more babies on the non-power street compared to the other ones. They're non-equivalent. We didn't randomly assign them. We didn't control. We didn't manipulate which group that they're in, but they're pretty equal. That's a non-equivalent control groups design. So the question is, in a non-equivalent control group design, you're going to have the most trouble with which of these criteria for causality? Internal validity. You most have the most problem with internal validity. So why internal validity? Well, let's think about it. Let's talk about the birth rate and power example. So covariance. Could we establish that people who had their power out had more babies later on? Yeah, they could covariate. We just measure. Yeah, did the power out? Yeah. Did they have babies? Yep. Temporal precedence. Could we figure out whether or not the power outage came before having babies? Yep, we could do that. That'd be easy to do. Internal validity, that becomes harder. All of the problems with internal validity that we've already discussed could be a problem here. So you can think about it like internal validity. What could it be? Something else? Maybe it's sunlight. Maybe one side of the street gets more sun, and people who have more sun are less likely to stay inside and less likely to have sex, and therefore less likely to have babies. Could be. I don't know. That's an internal validity problem if that was the problem. It could be whatever else happened to affect them. Maybe in that side of the street, they also had different water quality, and different water quality somehow affected the birth rate. Okay, that would be the problem with a non-equivalent control group design. If you're doing this within groups, the best way to do it is with an interrupted time series design. Now, this is not just a pre-test, post-test, measure once, measure twice. You need something to interrupt the time. So, for example, let's say that I felt that stress affected your happiness. Well, instead of manipulating how much stress people have, what I did is I'll measure your happiness at the beginning of the spring semester. But then instead of just measuring again at the end of the spring semester, I will stagger it. Therefore, I measure at the beginning of the semester, but then I also measure right before spring break. The interruption is spring break. And then I'll measure again right after spring break, and then again at the end of the semester after you've been stressed for a little bit longer. Okay? The idea is that there's a natural interruption that's going on in the time. In this case, it's spring break. And spring break should diminish people's stress. So what I should see is that you would start the semester with relatively low stress, then it increases. Then when you hit spring break, so right before spring break it's high, and then right after spring break it's back low again. And then it increases until the end of the semester. It is an interrupted time series design. It's the same people we're looking at. We're repeating that measure just like we would within groups. But what's going on is the interruption kind of counts as of demonstrating that it's not just passage of time. This interruption seems to have a specific effect. So the same question. In an interrupted time series design, you're going to have the most trouble with, well, again, this one would have more trouble with internal validity because we can see covariance. We can see how times of stress increase, all right, and happiness goes with it. We can figure that out. We can figure out that stress is increasing before the happiness. That's easy to figure out as well. It's internal validity that's the problem. Is it really the lack of stress that's causing the differences, or maybe it's being with roommates that causes a lack of happiness, right? Because spring break, you don't have the roommates, and then you right back from spring break, you've been without your roommate for a long time, and so you're happier, that kind of a thing. That would be an internal validity problem. Welcome to Chapter 13, Part 2. All we're going to do with this one is go through several scenarios and talk about what kind of designs we have and review some of the concepts from Chapter 13. Okay, let's say that McDonald's wants to know if people like their Justin Bieber ad more than their Beyonce ad. They randomly show half of YouTube viewers one advertisement and half they show the other. Then they measure their preference for the ad, which is true. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We've got people watching YouTube, all right? You either see the Justin Bieber ad or you see the Beyonce ad, okay? One or the other. And then you're randomly shown those two different ads. Now, let's think about it. Is this a factorial design? This is not a factorial design. In a factorial design, you need more than one factor contributing to the preference. In this case, all we have is Justin Bieber versus Beyonce. So the artist is the variable, the independent variable in this case, and then the preference is the other part. Okay. This is a quasi-experiment. Well, in this particular case, we did randomly show half one and half the other. So we were manipulating that variable. You either saw one or the other. Okay. So this is not quasi because we randomly assigned you to either see one or the other and then measured your preference. Is this within groups? The answer is no, because if it was within groups, you would see both the Bieber ad and the Beyonce ad. That would make it within groups. So the answer is none of these. None of these are involved. This is a true experiment. It's a factorial. It's not a factorial design. It's not a quasi-experiment. It's not within groups. It's none of these. Okay, same basic idea. Randomly show half of the YouTubers one advertisement, half they show the other. Then you measure your preference for the ad. Which one would not be a concern? Which one would not be a concern for this? Okay, now let's take a look. When you have this kind of design, it's independent groups. You either saw one or the other. When we randomly assign people, that's how we get rid of selection effects. Selection effects would mean that there's something about the people that puts them either into the Beyonce group or the Bieber group. So we're not worried about selection effects here because we randomly assign. We randomly assign them to one or the other. We're not worried about maturation because we only worry about maturation in a repeated measures design, like a within groups repeated measures design. And this is not even possible because this is independent groups. We're not worried about history effects here because those are only for within groups repeated measure designs. So in reality, none of these is a big concern because we took care of the selection effects when we randomly assigned. Okay, same scenario. Which of these is a big concern? Which of these would be the biggest concern? The biggest concern that we would have with this is probably design confounds. Now, there's probably ways that we have created this that make it improbable that they would be purely just Justin Bieber or Beyonce, right? So remember, the hypothesis is that the artist would affect the ad, right? Well, there's probably differences in the quality of the music between Justin Bieber and Beyonce. There's probably differences in the length of the advertisement between Justin Bieber and Beyonce. Probably a lot of other things that are not the same in the Justin Bieber and Beyonce ad besides Justin Bieber and Beyonce, right? For those to be the case, they would have to be exactly the same. Everything would be the same. The song is the same. The length is the same. The people in the background are the same. Everything's the same except for Justin Bieber or Beyonce. Otherwise, we're going to have design confounds, and that's most likely what we have. Carryover effects are only a problem when you have a repeated measure, so within groups, repeated measure design, so we're not worried about that. The placebo effect. Okay, now placebo effect has to mean that people actually believe that the treatment is causing a difference. Now, in this case, we're not particularly worried about that because people are either in the Justin Bieber or they're in the Beyonce ads. So there's not a particular thing. Their preference would be confounded with that. We're not particularly worried about that. The observer bias is not a problem here because the observers don't interact with or see who is interacting with the ads. So there's no problem with the observer bias side. Okay, my hypothesis is that studying makes you happier. I measure everyone's happiness in January before the semester starts, then again after their last final when they've completed everything. So this is one we've talked about before. I found that they're happier at the end of the semester. Which of these is true? The only thing that's true here is that this is a within groups design. This is not independent groups because that would mean that people, we would have half the people study and half not study. That's not what's going on here. It's within groups because everybody is doing a part where they hadn't studied yet. That's the beginning of the semester, and then at the end they had studied quite a bit. This is not an interrupted time series. In an interrupted time series, you got to interrupt it. You can't just have the pre and post. You got to have something in the middle that would indicate a lack of studying. Maybe spring break. Okay, maybe spring break would be one of those things, but it can't be B and C because this is actually not an interrupted time series. There's no interruption going on. A bank wants to know if it's better to have automated tellers or live tellers. One store only has live tellers while the other has automated tellers. They ask each customer who comes how much they enjoyed their visit to the bank when they leave the bank. So which of these is true? This is not a factorial design. This is not a factorial design. A factorial design means that we have to have more than one factor, more than one independent variable. So the only variable that's independent here is the presence of automated tellers, right? So the kind of teller would affect their liking, right? Their enjoyment. And in this case, there's two levels. They are automated teller or live teller. So we don't have a factorial design. We would have to have a totally different independent variable for a factorial design. This is a quasi-experiment. This is a quasi-experiment. Why? Because we did not randomly assign people to either go to the automated teller bank or the non-automated teller bank. They chose themselves. The bank is the same. The interactions are relatively, what you would do, the business you would do there is relatively similar, but it's not a true manipulation because we did not assign people to the two different banks. This is not a within groups experiment because for within groups, everybody would have to go to both the automated teller and to the live teller. So this is a quasi-experiment. A bank wants to know, same thing, so which of these is not a big concern with this particular setup? The answer is maturation effects. Maturation effects are not a big concern here. The other ones, that would be a concern. Selection effects has to do with something about people being in one level of the manipulation or the other. In this case, it's not a true manipulation, it's a quasi-experiment. So people are choosing whether or not they're going to be in this at this branch location or that branch location. So maybe people chose because they knew they'd have automated tellers there. Maybe they chose to be in this location because it's near their house. Maybe the one is in one neighborhood that's more expensive than the other neighborhood. So all those things could possibly be selection effects that could happen. Maturation effects means that over time something has changed in the individual that they have matured. Well, this can't be a possibility because we do not have a within groups design. It's a repeated measure. We don't have that. Demand characteristics could be a problem. It's going to probably be pretty obvious if somebody waits outside and you just went to an all automated teller and they said, hey, how much did you enjoy your experience? You have a pretty good guess that they're asking about this automated teller thing. And you might say, oh, they want me to say they like it, but I like it as much as anything else. That would be a demand characteristic. So in this situation, again, this is a quasi-experiment. Specifically, it is a non-equivalent groups design. So let's keep going with this, a new one. Which of these would not be a concern? And in this particular case, carryover effects would not be a big concern because carryover effects only happen in within groups designs repeated measures. We could have design confounds because one bank could be in a different neighborhood, et cetera. We've talked about that before. The Rosenthal effect is a form of observer bias. Now remember, in this case, they're asked they ask each person as they come out. So it could be that the way the researchers are asking could influence them one way or the other. So for example, if they thought that if the hypothesis was that automated tellers are just as good as living tellers, then it could be they'd say, how much did you enjoy your experience with this living teller? Versus, how much did you enjoy your experience with these automated tellers, right? Even that would be a Rosenthal effect or observer bias. Okay, thanks everybody.